recall that we did a 30,000-foot view of the Psalms and wanted to kind of get a sense of the overall makeup of how the Psalter was put together. Bob was kind enough to tell me the audio wasn't great, so we thought we'd use a microphone, partly for those of you to hear me better, and partly so that it can pick up for those who can't be here this morning to see a little better. So if you like tables, you've got the back. If you're here early enough to grab a couch, you can have the couch. So good job on that. You can doze off. That's right. That's right. We have the front row with arms if you want arms, so that's good. Chuck and I were having a debate exactly where a back row Baptist is supposed to sit in this study. He doesn't really know where the back row is here, but we'll work through it. I don't know, I'm trying to think if there's anything I need to update us on before we get going. Remember last week, just as a survey for those of you who might not have been here, the Book of Psalms is 5 books, actually, starting with cleverly titled Book 1, Book 2, Book 3, Book 4, and Book 5. And most of the David Psalms in the front end. But today we're going to look at one that is not a David Psalm. We're going to look at the very, very first Psalm. One of my dear friends and sort of feels like an older sister in academia, Nancy DeClassy Walford, she's an expert on the Psalms as well, and her book is called Reading from the Beginning, because she believed that beginnings shape the rest of the way you see things. And so she analyzed the beginnings of each of the books of the Psalms. So she looked at Psalm 1, Psalm 42, Psalm 73, Psalm 90, Psalm 107, to look at how that shapes the rest of the reading. And for her, Psalm 1 in particular was incredibly important. But I want to say a few words of oversight just on Book 1 in particular. Remember we talked about Book 1 being Psalms 1 to 41. It opens with 2 untitled Psalms, and then the next 39 are all Psalms of David. We talked last week about how to interpret Psalms of David and what that means. Most of the Psalms in Book 1 are laments, which we also talked about last week. So that's a lot of Psalms, 24 or 41, of people complaining about their health, complaining about enemies, complaining about being slandered by people that they formerly trusted. A lot of songs. Again, remember, this is the hymn book of ancient Israel. And 24 of 41 of their first 41 hymns, are them complaining to God about the situation in life. And the funny part about that is happiness or blessedness is the major focus of Book 1, which I guess is ironic. Here are all verses that have this word that's often translated happiness. Sometimes it's translated blessed. Probably the best way I think to understand that word, the word is ashrei in Hebrew, and the best way I think to understand that word is the feeling that comes when you know that God has heard you. That's probably the best way to think about it. We don't really have a good, single, elegant English word to do that. But the feeling that comes when you know that God has heard you. Happiness doesn't quite catch it, because you can still be in times of struggle and know that God has heard you and be content, but content isn't quite strong enough. Blessed probably isn't quite right, although it's sometimes used that way as well. So that's the way I would say it. The feeling that you have when you know that God has heard you. Satisfaction. Maybe a little more than that. I don't know. That's the thing. Mike McKeever, my podcast partner, has a master's in linguistics, and he always makes fun of people that say you can't translate a word. And he says what they mean is you can't translate the word elegantly. Because what always happens is someone says, you can't translate this word, and then they go on to tell you what the word means. It's like, well, you just translated the word. You just didn't do it elegantly. I don't think there's any elegant way to translate the word here. But as you can see, these are all verses that deal with happiness. Starting in verse 1, that's the first word, is in Psalm 1. Psalms after Psalm 1 and 2 show a contrast to the word happiness, because the righteous do not prosper from Psalm 3 to 41. In fact, they are sick, their enemies are after them, they are struggling, they don't know what to do. The righteous seem to be always right on the edge of death. The powerful always seem to be exploiting them. And as a result, the word refuge is a very popular word that comes up in the Psalms as well. In fact, there was a scholar named Jerome Creech who believed that word actually was the focus of all of the Psalms. That the word refuge was the most important concept in the book of Psalms. And he did a book on that, The Lord is My Refuge, all the way through. So it's very, very common. It occurs 14 times in that first book. And sometimes we can combine the idea, happy are those who seek refuge in the Psalm. So let's look at the Psalm in book 1. This is from the New Revised Standard Translation. And I always highlight these things to remind myself that I meant to say things about those words. So that's what those highlights mean, so I don't forget. Happy are those who do not follow the advice of the wicked, or take the path that sinners tread, or sit in the seat of scoffers. But their delight is in the law of the Lord, and on his law they meditate day and night. They're like trees planted by streams of water, which yield their fruit in its season, and their leaves do not wither. In all that they do, they prosper. The wicked are not so, but are like chaff that the wind drives away. Therefore the wicked will not stand in the judgment, nor sinners in the congregation of the righteous. For the Lord watches over the way of the righteous, but the way of the wicked will perish. So, fairly straightforward when you look at it, you would think. It seems that good people get good things and bad people get bad things, just like the world works, right? That's just the way we have all experienced the world, where good people always are blessed and bad people always are punished. Maybe not so much, right? Maybe that's not exactly how the world works on that. There's a lot to talk about. I want to do a little bit of translation first. The word law that we see there is it is the translation of the Hebrew word Torah. And one thing that you learn from just about every single Old Testament professor you will ever meet is that none of them like the translation law for the word Torah. The problem is I think, cultural. The word law in our culture does not conjure what the word law that the word Torah did in the ancient culture. In my experience, and I think I've shared this before, but my experience in 21st century America, laws seem to be things that people don't want to get caught breaking. It's apparently okay to break them so long as you don't get caught breaking them. It's apparently okay to speed as long as you're not caught speeding. It's apparently, I mean, that seems to, I'm not advocating that. I'm saying that that's my sense of people. Take words out of context for me on that. But yeah, it seems to be that's it. That is absolutely not what the word Torah means. Torah comes from the root word in Hebrew for teaching or instruction. So in other words, the better, more healthy way to think of Torah is that this is God's instruction, God's teaching for how you live. And so this is the way you have the best possible life, is that you follow Torah. And so the delight of the person is God's Torah, and they're meditating on the Torah. That word meditating is a fun word. In Hebrew, it is the word haga. It only occurs a few places. It's also in some places the translation that sound an animal makes, that they growl. That word sometimes is translated growling over the Torah. And it has been suggested that it is an onomatopoetic word. In other words, it sounds like what it is, that you are growling over the text as you think about. Most texts and prayers were done out loud. Reading was done out loud. There was not internal, and so you're meditating, you're growling on God's word. This is important because the word only occurs a few times, and it occurs in the two consecutive Psalms, Psalm 1 and Psalm 2, as we go through there. But you see, they're going to be planted like trees sitting by the water. Good people are going to do that. You don't want to follow the advice of the wicked or take the path that sinners tread. I do like that translation. The King James and the NIV can have what I consider to be a misleading translation there, because they're being a little more, it's one of those where they're being a slave to the order of the Hebrew, and as a result, I think they're misleading in what the word means, because I think the King James has, happy is the person that does not stand in the way of sinners. The NIV has that same thing too. The reason I don't like that translation is because in American English, there is an idiom that you can stand in someone's way. Like, I'm going to stand in your way after this is over. Where am I going to be? I'm going to be in front of you, between you and the door, exactly. And so if you read that translation, you might get the sense that that means happy is the person who doesn't obstruct sinners. Just let them go. Just let the sinners go. Don't get in there. No, that's not what it means. The idea is that there is like a sinner's way, a sinner's road, and the person is blessed who doesn't hang out in that road. Yeah.
Who were the sinners in the wicked?
Well, that's a good question. They're not the one's not delighting in the Lord. They're the sinners.
So it could have been Israelites worshiping Baal?
It could, absolutely. In fact, most of the time, the enemies in the Psalms are fellow countrymen, are Israelites. There are a few occasions where they're referencing external enemies, Psalm 137 and some others like that. But most of the time, the person who is slandering you and oppressing you and being unjust towards you is the person.
Is
that you're related to, exactly. A person that you're absolutely related to. Yeah. Chaff that the wind drives away. My major professor, Dr. Bellinger, always translated this verse, the wicked are like dandelion fluff. So if you want to get a sense of that, I think that's a really nice dynamic equivalence translation of that. But yeah, we see that good people get good things and bad people get bad things. Now, as I joked initially, that's not the way the world works, right? I mean, good people aren't always blessed. Bad people are not always punished. In fact, maybe we'd say often, that is not the case when that happens. And so what's going on? And the Psalms themselves show that. Psalm 3, after Psalm 1 and 2, show that the wicked are prospering and the righteous are struggling. So how do you interpret that? How do you make sense of the fact that this psalm seems to be advocating a philosophy of life that is not at work in our lives? Now, real quick, you might hear me slip into this. That phrase, that philosophy of life, good people get good things, bad people get bad things, is called Deuteronomic Theology. That is the short term for that. Deuteronomic Theology is called that because in the book of Deuteronomy, that is the emphasis. The emphasis in the book of Deuteronomy is if you're obedient to God, you will inherit the land, you will have longevity, you will be blessed materially, things will go well if you obey God. If you don't obey God, judgment is going to come, troubles are going to happen, you're going to lose the land, bad things are going to happen. So that Deuteronomic theology is at work all throughout the Old Testament in certain books, like Deuteronomy, for example, Joshua, Judges, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, very strong Deuteronomic theology, Proverbs, very strong Deuteronomic theology. If you ever hear a health and wealth gospel preacher and they pull out Old Testament quotes, I promise you they're reading from Deuteronomy, they're reading from Proverbs, they might be reading from anywhere from Joshua to 2nd Kings, but they love Deuteronomy and Proverbs because that's where it's at work. The places they're not going, Job and Ecclesiastes, which are two books that are saying, really though? Does that really work that way? James Sanders is a biblical scholar, canonical biblical scholar. He has a saying that I use all the time. What he says is, the canon is self-correcting. And what he means by that is that the Bible is very good at keeping you from taking it out of context if you read all of it. You can't just cherry pick some of these verses and get that sense. And so Psalm 1 seems to be advocating that Deuteronomic theology, that Deuteronomic philosophy of life. It does seem, but that's not the whole story. And so there are a couple of ways to read that. Some suggest that, again, this is maybe for early followers, young faith, right? Where all of us come to God, I think, with the stages of faith. I love Bernard Clairvaux's stages of faith. When we're born, we love self for self. That's all we care about. We don't care if our parents are sleeping, we want to eat. We don't care if our dad's put on a new shirt, we need to throw up. Whatever it is. It's all about you when you're young. And I get that. As children, you have to do that to survive. That's good. But eventually, some of us can come to a point where we can love God for self. In other words, we want to go to heaven. We don't want to go to hell. We want material blessings here. We want healing here. That stage of faith. The next stage of faith, the one that we hope we get to, is to love God for God. That when you don't care about or have regard for self, the kind of faith we see at the end of the book of Job, the kind of faith I would argue we do see a little of in Ecclesiastes, the faith we see in Jeremiah, the faith we see in Abraham's willingness to give up Isaac. That sense of being able to love God for who God is, apart from how it affects you. In fact, it might actually even hurt you to follow God in that. It may lead you to, I don't know, crucifixion, hypothetically, in that regard.
I forgot to mention Jesus in that list.
That's where I was going to crucifixion there at the end. So, yeah. So that sense of loving God and who God is for God without regard for self. Okay? So this may be just that early stage of faith, right? Treasure in heaven, or trying to deal with people who are willing to love God for themselves. Maybe. Walter Brueggemann, a name that you might have heard because the Shalom class is reading a book by him this summer, is he sees the book of Psalms as the story of a faith journey. In other words, from Psalms from 1 to 150 represent an individual on a journey of faith. So at the beginning, life is simple, right? You follow God, you get blessed. Then very quickly you find out the world doesn't work that way in 3 through, most of the rest of the Psalms. When you get to Psalm 73 for Brueggemann, there's a turning point. That Psalm 73 for him is that moment that the person in Psalm 73 is asking the questions. I thought that this is the way the world works. I saw the wicked prospering. My foot almost slipped. I didn't know what to do about that, but I entered into the assembly of God, and I met the divine there, and the world made sense again, just in the presence of God. And then as you continue to move on through the Psalms, you get to Psalm 150, where it is praise just for the sake of praise. That it is just praising God for no reason whatsoever, not about self, but only about God. So for Brueggemann, he sees Psalm 1 standing at the beginning of a journey, and that you move through the Psalms, you come to the end of the journey in 150, where he's actually praising God for who God is. That's a possible reading of this psalm as well. I also think, I don't have a problem with any of those readings of the Psalter, actually. But one of the things that I think is interesting is to see it. Ancient Israel knew their traditions, and they knew their traditions better than we know their traditions, and they would invoke them and make references, just like we do. We can make references. I could say, "May the Force be with you." You know, I'm using Star Wars. I could say, "I'm not throwing away my shot." You know, I'm talking about Hamilton. I could use all of these popular cultural references, and I could just use a bit of them, and you'll get that reference. You'll have that context. The question we don't have is, what is he doing there? What are those ancient writers invoking that we're missing? But there are a couple of things that we can know. For example, this section here, trees planted by streams of water, is very similar to this passage in Jeremiah chapter 17. Happy or blessed are those who trust in the Lord, whose trust is the Lord. They shall be like a tree planted by water, sending out its roots by the stream. It shall not fear when the heat comes. Its leaves shall stay green. In the year of drought, it's not anxious, and it does not cease to bear fruit. That's a fairly familiar passage, it sounds to me like, in Jeremiah 17. Well, who's plagiarizing who? Do we have some folks sitting a little too close together in Old Testament class? That's what's happening. No, I think that it's very likely that the psalmist is invoking Jeremiah here. I think that now remember, this Jeremiah passage is coming. By the way, that's what happens to the wicked. They're living in parched places of the wilderness in an uninhabited salt land. The wicked are not being blessed. The righteous are being blessed. Jeremiah is preaching this as the exile is occurring. Okay, so people are being taken away from their homes by the Babylonians. They're being led off into captivity far away where they don't speak their language. They've had family members that have been killed. They've had farms that have been burned. And in the midst of that message, Jeremiah says, those who trust in the Lord are going to be like trees planted by the water. In other words, hang in there. It's a word of encouragement in the midst of suffering. A word of hope in the midst of complete despair when you're losing everything all around you. And there's actually one other reference here. The Lord watches over the way of the righteous, but the way of the wicked will perish. That word watches, literally, and some translations do this, it says, the Lord knows the way of the righteous, and the way of the wicked will perish. Now, knowledge in Hebrew, the word yada, which by the way is where George Lucas got the name Yoda, in case you were curious. It means knowledge is what Yoda's name means. It's a Hebrew word. That's a true story. That's actually, I know I joke around a lot, but I mean that one. That one's real. The Lord watches. Knowledge is intimate. Knowledge is close. Knowledge is connected. When you know, it's a word that can be used for sexual intimacy. It's a word that is complete closeness. God knows the way of the righteous. There's one other really interesting place where that happens. This is in Exodus chapter 2. The last verse in Exodus chapter 2 verses. After a long time, the king of Egypt died. The Israelites groaned under their slavery and cried out. Out of the slavery, their cry for help rose up to God. God heard their groaning. God remembered his covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. God looked upon the Israelites, and God took notice of them. Literally, the last word in Hebrew is that God looked upon the Israelites, and God knew. That's all it says. And God knew. There's an association that God has with his people in the midst of their suffering. And the fact that that phrase is used directly in reference to the suffering that occurred in the Exodus, and then occurs here, the Lord knows the way of the righteous, it might be not a statement that things are going to be great for you righteous people, but a statement of hang in there, you're not alone. That if you endure, if you hang in there, if you make it to the end, it won't always be like this. God knows where you are. God has regard for you. There is hope. So I think I've been talking a lot. And you guys have questions that far, I'll stop it. Yes, sir.
Yes, I have a question is, one thing is, how are we going to live proper life? So
Well,
that is very interesting.
In the case of Psalm 1, it's thinking about Torah, Genesis. The question was, how do we live a proper life? What is God's question? When the psalmist is writing this, he's thinking Genesis to Deuteronomy. He's thinking the Torah that God has instructed, don't kill, don't commit adultery, honor your father and mother, don't make idols, that sort of thing. In our case, our Torah for Christians has been reduced. There were 613 rules of instruction in the Old Testament. We've got one. Love God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength. Love you, and Jesus said that's exactly the same as loving your neighbor as yourself. And so that Torah, I think, for us, is the Torah that we need to be meditating on. And I also don't think it's going to make everything rosy, but I do think that it is the way that gives hope. It's the way that bears fruit. It's the way that sees us through exile and struggle and health concerns and former friends slandering us and that sort of. So I do read Psalm 1 as being much deeper than it seems on the surface. I don't think it's just about good people get good things and bad people get bad things. I think it's you commit yourself to God because that's the way that gives hope long term.
It's don't to be bad happen to be, we do not know. First of all, we need to be involved in the voluntary, So if this is supposed to be, control things, we control my mistake. There is something bigger problem, Therefore, we're having to ask for very unusual things, That happen, anything could be happening. So we do not know is the God and us to be how to know, pray, and we do not decide is because and
right. You don't want to reduce God to a divine vending machine, where I put in $1 worth of obedience, so I get $1 worth of blessing back. Oh, I put in $1 worth of wickedness, so I'm getting $1 worth of punishment. And it makes you start. God becomes this giant box in the sky. It turns out God is much bigger than that. God will actually walk beside the Israelites. He knows what's going on during the Exodus. He walks beside them in that suffering. We would have a God who suffers. Even again, God is Jesus, Jesus is God. We see Jesus suffering on the cross. God is suffering with his people in the Old Testament as well. So, yeah, Jim.
Didn't we have a school of theology, I think it was in the early part of this country, called Protestant ethic, in which if you were rich, that showed God's favor.
Correct. Yes. Yeah. And
what would happen?
it usually doesn't stand up to scrutiny as part of the problem. Yeah, it is that Protestant work ethic. Yeah, obviously. Well, that's, I think, what Jesus is confronting. He said that the school of theology in this country that suggested the Protestant work ethic, that if you're wealthy, it's because God has blessed you. He said, whatever happened to that? And I said, it didn't bear scrutiny. And Jesus actually has the same issue. When Jesus says, blessed are the poor in the Sermon on the Plain, in the book of Luke, everyone standing next to Jesus had to have said, what did he say? Because the assumption is the rich are blessed. They're the ones, because they're rich, obviously. It's just science when you think about it. Jesus, you're just wrong. No, blessed are the poor. And then he goes on to say, boy, don't you just feel sorry for the rich? They just can't even get, camels that have an easier time get through an eye of a needle than a rich person getting into the kingdom of heaven. And everyone standing next to Jesus had to say, how does that even make sense? If the rich person isn't blessed, what? No, actually, it's the poor person who understands what it is to trust in God. That was God's biggest concern when the Israelites were about to take the land. When he said to them all throughout the book of Deuteronomy, my major concern for you is that you're going to wake up on third base and think that you hit a triple. That really was, that's my translation of it. What he says is, you're going to go into a land and you're going to take cities you didn't build, drink from cisterns you didn't dig, eat fruit that you didn't plant, and you're going to wake up and believe that you deserved it. And you're going to forget the Lord your God. You're going to forget that God is the one who provides these things by grace. And so, his biggest concern was to do that, to equate the blessing that you have with an assumption of righteousness. The prophets preach against that in Hosea. The prophets preach against that in Amos. Jesus preaches against it in the Gospels. It's a concern to equate blessing and God's will, because sometimes it can come back to surprise you that that's not actually the way that actually worked at all. Turns out you might have gotten your wealth immorally. I hear that happens. I don't. Other questions or concerns or thoughts?
I have
Alright.
another question.
Sure.
We are in the middle of the peace. How should we?
A little louder, just a little bit louder.
And going to be peace.
Oh, yes.
How should we act for peace?
How can we be at peace?
Our life.
How can life can be at peace? I think that's what the psalm is addressing. I think that's what the psalm is addressing. How we can be at peace is by, again, for our Torah,
Yeah.
loving God with all we have, which is loving our neighbors. That's what brings a life of shalom. That's what brings a life of flourish. That's what brings a life of and it's not necessarily a life that's going to lead to peace. I mean, I think Jeremiah 17 is suggesting, trees that will bear fruit are happening in the midst of exile. And Exodus is suggesting that God knows the way of the righteous, and sometimes that's in Egypt. But I think it's what provides the hope long term. Yeah, absolutely.
Rob, I have a question.
Sure.
About redemption. Not a lot of talk about redemption.
Mhm.
So you're either part of the righteous or you're part of the unrighteous, and that's it.
Well, the problem we sometimes we're forgetting here is that these are all the same people he's talking to. As I was saying earlier, most of the time the wicked in the Psalms are fellow Israelites, people who were descendants brought up out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery, standing right beside you in the midst of that. And they're the ones who are slandering you, and they're the ones who are abusing you, and they're the ones who are trading. So we're not, the insiders are the ones who are acting like the outsiders in the Psalter at this point. And so it's really, it's adding a level that I think sometimes we can think in terms of, well, they're the outsiders and they're the wicked and we're the righteous because we're the insiders. And the psalmist is saying, well, actually, it's the insiders who are causing most of these problems. It's the unrighteous judges. It's the unrighteous business people with the dishonest scales. It's the that sort of thing. So we're trying to encourage those who are meditating, growling on God's Torah in the midst of a world that's working against them. Sometimes they're very young people. So, yeah. What else? Well, I said this is Psalm 1, and it is Psalm 1, but I also want to look at Psalm 2, and there's a reason I want to look at Psalm 2, because some people connect Psalm 2 and Psalm 1. We'll look real quick at Psalm 2. Why do the nations conspire and the peoples plot in vain? The kings of the earth set themselves, and the rulers take counsel together against the Lord and his anointed, saying, let us burst their bonds asunder and cast their cords from us. He who sits in the heavens laughs, the Lord has them in derision. Then he will speak to them in his wrath, terrify them in his fury, saying, I've set my king on Zion, my holy hill. I will tell of the decree of the Lord. He said to me, you are my son. Today I have begotten you. Ask of me, and I will make the nations your heritage, and the ends of the earth your possession. You shall break them with a rod of iron, dash them in pieces like a potter's vessel. Now therefore, O kings, be wise, and be warned, O rulers of the earth. Serve the Lord with fear, with trembling kiss his feet, or he'll be angry, and you will perish in the way, for his wrath is quickly kindled. Happy are all who take refuge in him. The reason these two psalms are read together is because, first of all, both of them are untitled. And sometimes you put two untitled psalms together, they seem to have been maybe part of a larger psalm. This happens a little bit later in the Psalms as well. And also there is what is known as an inclusio in poetic terms. And that means that the last verse of the second psalm ends with exactly what the first verse of the first psalm starts with. Ashrei, and then Ashrei. And perhaps implying this is part of a larger unit, or at least need to be thought of as a larger unit. I will say that most Psalm scholars do read Psalms 1 and 2 as an introduction, and that they think of Book 1 proper starting at Psalm 3. That they think Psalm 1 and 2 are an introduction to the whole Psalms, but that they were added a little bit later as an introduction. Because I said you can't add a psalm into the middle of your hymn book, because that's hard to do, but you can stick one at the beginning pretty easily. And so they thought that perhaps after the exile, that's when these psalms were added to say, when you read the Psalms, think of them this way. So Psalm 2, not dealing necessarily with righteous and wicked on a smaller scale, but righteous and wicked on the national scale. So here's where we move a little bit beyond just our people, but those other nations that are oppressing. Babylonians, Assyrians, Persians are actually the good guys in the Old Testament. but they're the folks that you need to worry about. By the way, these peoples and these nations are plotting in vain. Same word as the meditate in Psalm 1. So, whereas the righteous person is haga, meditating on the Torah, the nations and the peoples that are haga in vain things. They're meditating on vain things. They're making vain plots to come against God's anointed. Messiah in Hebrew, where we get the word Messiah. It is a royal reference. Kings are all anointed. That's the term they can use for it, is that they are the anointed. What's interesting about this is that when the Greek Septuagint was translated, when the Septuagint, which is the Greek Old Testament, was translated, it was the missionary Bible for Christians when they first went out with the Septuagint. Whenever they encountered this word anointed, they just translated it into the Greek word for anointed. Does anyone know what the Greek word for anointed means? Anyone know the Greek word for anointed? Christos. You actually did know the Greek word for anointed. Yes, Jesus Christ is Jesus the anointed. Jesus the Christ, the anointed one, the king. So those first Christian missionaries, they get their Old Testament out, and every time they see this, why do the kings of the earth set themselves against the Lord and his Christ? That's a great question, isn't it? Why? It was instantly able for them to jump immediately to moving this to a New Testament application for them. But here, it is absolutely the kings of the Old Testament that are being tapped down, and they're warning that the same judgment that comes on the wicked people is the judgment that's going to come on the nations at the same time. Real quick, this is very likely the passage that is referred to at Jesus' baptism. We're evoking today, "You are my beloved son," and then it jumps immediately from there to a suffering servant psalm, "In whom I am well pleased." So in other words, the baptism is joining a royal psalm which talks about Christ's kingship with the suffering servant psalm instead of the "Today I have begotten you" one. So really clever use of Old Testament psalms and passages there in baptism. So. Questions, comments? Gene, you had a frown on your face, like I needed to.
It was the Jewish translation of the word.
Messiah?
Yeah.
Okay.
You've got two contexts.
Mm-hmm.
I'm assuming that whoever translated it put it in that context, and that's how they got the English word, the two English words that are so almost opposites.
You mean
coming out of the same Jewish
which
word.
ones?
The meditate. And,
Oh, meditate. Okay.
Meditate
And plot. Yeah. Yeah, that's one of the challenges of Hebrew is one word can carry a lot of meanings. The vocabulary is simpler, but that means that it's more complicated at the end of the day. Like, for example, the word in Hebrew to lift up is also the Hebrew word for to bear or to carry or to wear. And in some contexts, it's a word for forgiveness. And so you have this beautiful image of forgiveness being a lifting up or a carrying of perhaps a burden or an act of forgiveness, which is a beautiful picture, but it also gives you a lot of meanings as you go there. So meditate, plot, growl, grunt, those are all definitions of the word haga. And
But in the translation, people who have English are blessed by the curse of English. There
Right.
are so many ways to translate.
Correct.
Who,
Well, see, this is when I disagree with God that Pentecost was a good idea. Because I think it'd be much better if we all just learned Hebrew. That's just me. And Greek. I think we should take our time and read Hebrew and Greek because it allows for those kinds of multiple meanings and the semantic ambiguity and beautiful interpretation. And then yet, God comes along and says, no, you can translate it. And the translation is the Bible. I still don't know about that. God and I are going to have a conversation on that. Because
Maybe that's why the Catholics just stuck with Latin.
with Latin,
So
I tell you, it's easier. It just is. Or why the Muslims stay with Arabic, right? It's not the Quran when you translate it. It is only the Quran in Arabic, which frankly makes a lot more sense. Just you don't have this kind of kooky, everybody's got a different translation thing. And yet, here comes God who says, no, the gospel can be translated to your language, to your culture, without any diminishment, and I'm pretty sure God would understand the limits of language. and translation. And yet God still said that was a good idea. I have said many times, it is the most dangerous miracle that God worked is Pentecost because of this. Yeah, Bob?
I think that if we all spoke one language and we only had one translation,
Yeah.
we would still argue over the meaning.
Oh, well, I'm certain of that. I just think it'd be easier.
I don't think we
You don't think it'd be easier?
No.
Yeah, I mean, the notion that God wants us in our diversity, that it is the gospel that unites us, not shared language or shared culture, is beautiful. It's just hard.
I think our struggling together is what helps us all reach a little bit closer to the truth.
I don't disagree with you. It just gets so hard sometimes.
Yeah, that could be, what is it? Exactly, the translation is exactly very important.
It is.
So that could be one message translation.
It absolutely is.
Working on.
Translation is incredibly difficult.
Yeah, it's hard, and next translation, so it's working on.
It is.
Here now.
Yeah, you're exactly right. Jim?
Continuing in the same thing with translation.
Sure.
Can we go back and talk about that sex thing?
The sex thing? Oh, about knowledge?
He knew.
He knew.
Now,
Yeah.
there are any number of ways you could have expressed that, I think, in Hebrew.
Yes.
But we say knew as
Knowledge.
Yes, they have knowledge of, but he didn't mean that. He means sexual relations. But so that's one meaning for that same
Sure.
translation.
It is. It
Or
is.
was it a hesitancy to talk about something in it?
No, I don't think it was. The Hebrews had no problems being more earthy than we are. In fact, the number of, I have a wonderful article that I love showing my students about the places where the English translations hide the explicit sexual nature of Song of Songs in the translation. There are they play with the multiple possible meanings and pick the most obscure one. So when you read it in English, you're like, I don't have any idea what that's saying. And that's good for most of us in church. But yeah, the Hebrews didn't have any problems talking about that. And I think I would go the other way. I think it is more an expression of how they understood sexual intimacy as bringing knowledge or connection or understanding between two people in a way that is deeper than we just use the word know. So I would actually flip it a little bit there, which is the same thing I do with, say, forgiveness with lift up. You know, I lift up my eyes into the hills. That is the same as to carry or to bear. It's to take the name of the Lord in vain. Same word. To take the name of the Lord in vain is to lift up or to carry, which is a sense of speaking, but also to bear or to wear. In other words, do not wear the name of the Lord in meaninglessness. Do not call yourself a follower of God if your life is not going to be defined by Torah. Now, part of that is speech, but that commandment is a whole lot more than just speech. That commandment is about living life that shows that you are a redeemed people, that you have been saved, that life you live reflects Torah, that you will not take the name. It's a marriage ceremony. They're standing at Mount Sinai. You will be our God, we will be your people, and are you willing to bear that? Well, that's the real question. Absolutely. Well, I think that brings us to an end. Thank you for your good attendance and your good attention. And I will see you all next week. I believe we're doing Psalm 23 next week. We may need more chairs. So thank you for coming.
Let me ask.
Please.
We've got 5 minutes.
Sure.
I really like the issue of Pentecost.
Yes.
And the diversity.
Beautiful.
Because for me, this points that all language is pointing to something beyond itself.
Yes.
And the words are not the reality. It is what we symbolically try to represent. And so no one word is going to do it.
Which is the reason I love the fact that you can't translate God's name. It doesn't capture the fullness of what that name is. And it is you're exactly right. It's a beautiful thing. Well, boy, it's hard. When you live together in community, that's a hard miracle.
And there's nothing new about life being hard.
No, that's right. That's right.
My wife, Hi.
So it's a good friend. How are you?
Pentecost forces us to deal with
I think so. Some days